All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to talk about the Russian Imperial Movement, which is an organization with pretty interesting beliefs inside of Russia that is leveraging the war in Ukraine to advance their ideology and goals, which is not a good thing for most of us outside of Russia, even probably for a lot of people inside of Russia. Now, the source article here was written by Lucas Weber and Alec Bertina, two of the co-founders of Militant Wire, which is just kind of the go-to publication if you're looking at some of these smaller offshoot non-state actor organizations, although Russian Imperial Movement has a lot of very close ties to the Russian government. And they published this article that I'll link in the description below in the West Point Combating Terrorism Center's publication known as the CTC Sentinel. And fun fact, I was one of the first people, I think, to get a minor in terrorism studies from the Combating Terrorism Center. It's like a think tank there on West Point. I got that in 2009. I think they just opened up that minor in like 2007 or 2008. But anyways, that also great resource if you're interested in terrorism or some of these lesser known groups around the world. So starting out, we're going to get into an overview of the Russian Imperial Movement, talk about their history, how they were formed, their ideology, which is actually a big portion of understanding this group today, their history in Ukraine, and the threat they pose going forward. So starting out, the authors say, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin created a storm of controversy when he declared denazification as one of the special military operations objectives. Putin was referring to hardline nationalist fighters from Azov, Free Corps, Right Sector, and other formations. However, many were quick to point out the irony of his statement, considering Russia has various far-right elements fighting in and alongside its armed forces, including the neo-Nazi Rusich organization and volunteers from the Russian Imperial Movement. I actually posted about Rusich recently and realized that not very many people know about that organization, but it is, the founder described himself as a Nazi. Like, it's not hidden. You don't have to dig for clues or anything. The founder outright said that, and that is a rough organization. Take the ideology out of it entirely, and they have, been accused of some pretty substantial human rights abuses and war crimes already in the war in Ukraine. They continue saying, quote, the Russian Imperial Movement describes itself as an imperialist, ultra-reactionary, Russian Orthodox, fascist, anti-liberal, and anti-communist organization. That's a lot to pick apart. They're really dialed in on what they believe, I guess, right? They're pretty specific, just a lot of specifics. So in terms of where this organization first came about, they kind of date back even to kind of as the Soviet Union was dismantled, but the current kind of iteration or incarnation of the Russian Imperial Movement, they say was formed around 2 decades ago, but gained increased attention from Western security officials and researchers in the mid to late 2010s, with the group being designated as a special designated global terrorist entity by the U.S. Department of State and the Canadian government in April 2020. And something the authors point to here is the reason they kind of ended up more on the world stage is that at that point, Wagner was getting a lot more attention. So in a sense, you can kind of group RIM, the Russian Imperial Movement, in with Wagner, kind of, in that they're these non-state actors kind of operating to a degree on behalf of the state. You're going to see where the Imperial Movement is active, and it's all in places to generally benefit the Russian state. So it's no surprise that as Wagner got more attention, governments like the United States, Canada, and others were looking around, figuring out, how are we going to deal with these guys? And to be blunt, we don't have a great answer even today. But as they were going through that, identifying some of these other groups like the Russian Imperial Movement that kind of fit that same context. So looking into their ideology, again, this will help kind of shape their goals going forward and how they could be a threat outside of Russia, during and after this war. The authors say the Russian Imperial Movement is best encapsulated as an organization with firstly political elements and secondary paramilitary elements in the form of the Russian Imperial Legion. So you're going to see that pop up a couple times in this article. There's really two entities. The Russian Imperial Movement, think political. Russian Imperial Legion, think military. They are both a part of the same organization, Imperial Legion working as the paramilitary aspect of the Imperial Movement. They say a central feature of the Imperial Movement's dogma is a staunch commitment to monarchism in the model of Tsarist Russia. That is not something you see often. There's not a lot of modern organizations out there beating the drum saying, when we had it good, when things were really moving like they should, is back when we had kings and queens in charge of our country. That's, I guess, the direction the Imperial Movement wants to go here. They say naturally the commitment to the reforging of the Russian Empire also makes RIM an expansionist and militaristic organization at its core. As shown by RIL, again, the military branch of RIM, their involvement in Ukraine, RIM is committed to the restoration of all lands that belonged to the Russian Empire in the past, referring to them as Lesser Russia. And that right there is kind of the core as to how this organization is going to be operating, back from 2014 until current day, and at least as the war continues. We're going to see a lot of strife between the Imperial movement, the Imperial Legion, and the Russian government. They're not big fans of Putin, not by a long shot. But this piece right here, if they want to, reestablish the Russian Empire, if you will, a major portion of that is recapturing some of these lost territories. So for the time being, they're kind of on the same page as the broader Russian state. They do have some interesting aspects here, getting into their kind of ideology. They say Bolshevism has held back and corrupted the fatherland, and that they claimed Karl Marx was the greatest example of Russophobic scum. I guess it's the idea that anything that wasn't the monarchy was bad and took them in the wrong direction. Again, I'm no Russia expert, not by a long shot. I feel like you don't normally hear this kind of overtly negative talk about major portions in Russian history. They talk about a lot of kind of racism and xenophobia within the organization, a lot aimed at migrants from Central Asia moving into Russia, and then a lot towards Muslims, which they refer to, I guess, generally as Wahhabists, which is kind of a slur. Wahhabism is just a very, very small sect. It's an offshoot from Sunni Islam. All things considered, when looking at all Muslims around the world, it is a very small portion, but it is something that has been used as a slur in this kind of context. They continue, again, sticking to the ideology here. They say RIM is explicitly pro-nationalist, frequently citing concerns about high abortion rates inside of Russia. They say RIM has also made numerous associations between homosexuality and Satanism. In terms of organizational culture, there's an emphasis on fitness and mixed martial arts, as seen with other hard-right groups such as the Ukrainian Azov Brigade and the Russian Volunteer Corps. Now, we're spending a fair amount of time on the ideology. I got it. That's not generally my expertise or where I like to focus. I just think it's important here to better understand the overall context of how this organization fits into, the current fight, Russian government, Russian policy, and what it could mean going forward. Kind of wrapping up the ideology piece here, the authors say RIM certainly appeals to white identity in wanting a mono-ethnic state, and some of its members may harbor neo-Nazi beliefs. But efforts are made to distinguish its ideology, which is most focused on reviving and fighting to protect the Russian people and the Orthodox faith, both at home and abroad, saying that RIM aspires for a political system based on Tsarist Russia rather than Nazi Germany. I'm glad the authors put that in there. I don't think I'm alone when I say that the term Nazi has been so overused as of late. It's kind of lost its power in a way. I think people kind of write it off when they hear organizations described as such. And they are out there 100%. There are organizations and people that 100% are Nazis. A lot of them will say it. But in this instance, I like how the authors said, there might be some of those sentiments within the organization, but at least, from the top down, the message they're trying to put out is not in line with Nazism, but it's more in line with Tsarist Russia, trying to get back to that imperial state. Now, moving into the current leadership, the authors really focus on two people. You've got the political leader, Stanislav Vorobyev, and the paramilitary leader, Denis Garyev, who we're going to spend most of the time on. Real quick on Vorobyev, the political leader, he's come out and said that socialism and liberalism are destructive ideologies and that the West intends to export those to Russia to try to destroy it. So you kind of get an idea of his personal ideology there. Then you've got the leader of the Russian Imperial Legion, or the paramilitary arm, Denis Garyev. They say his background is in hand-to-hand combat, handling legally acquired firearms, which I thought was an interesting term the authors put in there. Why it didn't just say handling firearms or firearms training. The legally acquired piece I thought was interesting. And instructing military courses run through the Imperial Movement's training center. And that's kind of how Garyev has come to be more and more involved in the war in Ukraine. Now, they do have ongoing operations in the war today, but it dates back to 2014. The Russian Imperial Movement was involved pretty early, but there's not a lot of information about what they were doing in the war, and they seem to have withdrawn relatively quickly. They say a handful of the fighters remain and kind of tied in with the Luhansk or Donetsk People's Republic pro-Russian forces, could have still been fighting there in 2022 or even today, as they've been kind of absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. But they say that one of the reasons the imperial movement kind of pulled out of Ukraine just a few years after that kicked off in 2014 was the belief that the conflict had become co-opted by the government and oligarchic interests in Russia, Ukraine, and the West. So that's where we kind of start to see some of this ideology come through, right? They are very much pro-Russia. They want to see Russia succeed. They want to see Russia expand, but they're getting fed up with kind of the oligarchic nature of Putin's regime. And in their eyes, the war in 2014, 15, 16, that time frame was not really a war, but kind of a ploy by some of these, the man behind the scenes, if you will, inside of Russia, inside of Ukraine, and inside of the broader West. Now, they weren't just in Ukraine. According to their social media posts, they say that they had personnel operating in Syria, the Central African Republic, and Libya from 2015 to 2022. So that's what I was getting at earlier, saying they kind of follow the Wagner model in a sense. These non-state actors, they're active everywhere where Russia has interests. Right, so there is this, at least vague connection with the Russian military. They just happen to be where Russia needs people at those times. And when it comes to Syria, the Russian Imperial Legion said that they deployed to Syria as part of its crusade to protect the Christian faith against the Islamist hordes. I just want to, I'm going to complain about that for a second. The United States, we've made a lot of mistakes, right? I'm not going to try to pretend we haven't. But when we had, at least in my experience, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we spent so much time trying to learn the culture and to be respectful of the troops and the civilians. And I got it. It wasn't always perfect and mistakes were made. But we still get labeled as the ones going around trying to kill Muslims. And, again, just speaking from my experience, like that was never taught. That was never incentivized. It was the opposite. You want to avoid the civilian casualties at all costs and over the top explain that we're not here for any sort of religious reasons. Half the guys in our company or more have no religious affiliation at all. This isn't some sort of crusade, but here we have Russia just outright saying it. We are in Syria as part of a crusade to protect the Christian faith. I feel like, God, that not send off alarm bells somewhere? Like, had to have put a target on their back, right? Anyways, moving into current operations really tied to the ongoing war in Ukraine, they say the Imperial Legion has fought in places like Bakhmut, and most of their operations, be them offensive or defensive, are tied in with larger elements, focused primarily in the Donbass, which isn't crazy. Again, that's where a lot of them likely were in the early days of the war, and those who stayed behind would have been operating in the Donbass as well. They say that this war has kind of helped the Imperial Legion kind of strengthen their ties with the formal portions of the Russian government, the Ministry of Defense. However, on June 11, 2023, the Imperial Movement complained on Telegram about Russian President Vladimir Putin continuing his policy of not killing Ukraine's political elite and Western leaders visiting the country, in that case, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I think that is a great example of we see these groups rising up inside of Russia or getting a little notoriety and thinking, that'd be great. Maybe they could topple Russia. They could put together a new government, or they could have their voice finally heard. And just a quick reminder here that the Russian Imperial Movement, getting frustrated with Putin and not liking what he's doing in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons they don't like him is because he's not killing enough Western leaders when they travel to Ukraine. So, the grass isn't always greener. And the criticism from the Imperial Movement and Imperial Legion didn't stop there. Like, it continues all throughout. They, some of the forces that were at the front say that the Imperial Legion looked insanely good compared to, regular mobilized Russian soldiers in specifically the 155th Separate Marines Brigade during offensive operations at Volodar this past winter, January and February 2023. And kind of layering it on, some of these Imperial Legion members talked about the near suicidal nature of service in the Russian military. They were frustrated when Igor Girkin, the separatist leader, was arrested, and they talked about the Ministry of Defense's disregard for the value of lives in the Storm Z units made up of convicts. That's hard to argue. The Storm Z units, it kind of started with Wagner recruiting prisoners, and the casualty rates there, from all available information, have been staggering. These are the guys that are often sent out, or at least this was kind of towards the later stages of the Battle of Bakhmut. Information coming out on that front was that these Storm Z type units, the convicts in Wagner, would be sent out in small fire teams to essentially draw fire and find out where Ukrainian positions, where they had their machine guns and their heavy weaponry, what areas were mined and what areas were not. So they were disposable, we've used the term disposable infantry here. That is Stormzy unit, and the Imperial Legion's kind of calling out the Ministry of Defense in that regard. Kind of on that note, in the relationship between Wagner and the Imperial Legion, just after the failed mutiny on Moscow, Prigozhin's march on Moscow, Garyev, the leader of the Imperial Legion, came out and said that Prigozhin was either willingly or unwillingly contributing to the instability needed for the West to succeed against Russia regarding the invasion of Ukraine. He also claimed that despite the likelihood of such an attempted mutiny occurring, neither the Ministry of Defense nor the FSB was adequately prepared to deal with it. He emphasized in the video that this was all the byproduct of an increasingly corrupt and failing Russian state with no ideological foundation except for the pursuit of wealth. So, he's kind of taken the opportunity to advance his own cause, right? I think he has a valid point. The complaint inside of Russia that what Prigozhin was doing was creating cracks in the armor that could be exploited by Ukraine, NATO, the United States, anybody else. I don't think that's far off the mark. So you can understand how somebody who wants Russia to succeed could be frustrated that somebody like Prigozhin would even try to pull that stuff off and, make a big media blitz about the whole thing. But he brings it right back home to their core ideology, saying at the end of the day, it's not Shoigu, it's not Gerasimov, it's not Putin. The problem is the failing Russian state with no ideological foundation except for the pursuit of wealth, right? Join the movement. Probably the tagline they can throw on after that. Then after the death of Prigozhin, August 23rd, 2023, the Russian Imperial movement kind of changed their tune a little bit in how they talked about him. They referred to Prigozhin as being the only effective manager in the entire Putin regime, saying that, quote, Putin consciously or unconsciously lost, in fact, his only military support, who on his orders, without hesitation, would perform even the dirtiest of work. So it's this weird mixed relationship. But again, I think you have to view it in the light of their overall ideology. They want Russia to succeed. They don't necessarily like how it's going. But, Prigozhin was getting the job done in a lot of ways as far as they could see. I don't think they, just like Putin, I think they would probably view him as a necessary evil in the pursuit of their overall goals. But interesting commentary from a pro-Russian group here saying Putin just lost kind of his number one military commander, if you will. Continuing on May 31st, 2023, the Imperial Legion's Telegram channel commented on the Russian Volunteer Corps and Freedom of Russia's Legion's raid into the Belgorod region. If you remember, there was kind of a short 2 to 3 day raid carried out by those organizations in kind of the northeastern portion of Ukraine, is where they crossed the border into Russia. They called the Legion and the RVC traitors of the Russian people and the Orthodox faith, threatening that sooner or later we will meet them. Saying, interestingly, the overall commander of the Freedom of Russia Legion was a former member of the Russian Imperial movement. Just a little more on that. The Russian Volunteer Corps, the founder of that organization, Denis Nikitin, has some, overtly neo-Nazi ties and connections and ideology, right? That's not hidden. The Freedom of Russia Legion doesn't, at least nothing that I've seen. The Freedom of Russia Legion tends to be much more or their messaging is they want to do away with the Putin regime and put in place a Russian government for the Russian people kind of thing. So it's interesting that the Freedom of Russia Legion, the commander, has those ties to the Imperial movement, right? So they're both kind of looking for a change in the Russian government. I wonder if that core ideology of the monarchy being the ideal place to land still sits with the Freedom of Russia Legion. I haven't heard him say anything about that. Now, they say as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Imperial movement has expanded its military footprint in the region, and its military wing, the Russian Imperial Legion, has gained significant battlefield experience. And this is where the authors say that, one of the reasons for all the criticisms the Imperial movement and Imperial Legion have of Russia, of Putin, of Shoigu, of the Ministry of Defense, of all of those entities, and as much as they want them to be gone, there is some alignment, right? So this war has allowed the Imperial movement the opportunity, as they see it, to formally annex Lesser Russia. So for now, they're at least close enough to the same page. And the authors say that the Russian Imperial movement views the special military operation as a war to protect the Russian Orthodox religion and the ethnic Russian people who must be brought back under the wing of what the group views as their homeland. Now, in terms of what this threat means going forward, the organization is quite a bit smaller than Wagner. They do have a lot of advanced weaponry. They're relatively well equipped, but you're not talking about, from anything I've seen, tens of thousands of fighters within the Russian Imperial Legion. So this isn't like a group that if they get pulled off the front or it's going to be a major shock to the Russian military, and they're not going to lead their own charge anytime soon, be it in Ukraine or in Russia. But the threat this organization poses is more external, right? Of course, they want to implement all these changes inside of Russia. We'll see how that goes. It looks like kind of a tall task. I don't even know how many people inside of Russia would say, yeah, that monarchist setup is where I want to go. What they talk about here, though, is saying, quote, the Russian imperial movement poses a multifaceted threat to Ukraine and the West. The organization is in a position to enable terrorism by training Western individuals and groups using the experience accrued by Russian Imperial Legion personnel. The organization can transfer knowledge to Western extreme far-right groups to utilize that knowledge as they possibly did with the Nordic resistance movement. So that is where the possibility and the concern arises around this organization going forward. I think it's safe to say, who knows, with the demise of Wagner and that organization kind of splintering all over the place, maybe the Imperial movement and the Imperial Legion will become more active in places like the Central African Republic, other areas of Africa and the Middle East. But the big concern that the authors cite, and I think it's valid, is the connection with other far-right groups outside of Russia, imperialist-type movements, potentially, that want to utilize some of that knowledge gained on the battlefields of Ukraine. Drones, one, just stop there. The ability to teach people, and the Imperial Legion actually runs courses on drone warfare. So it's not a big leap to say that they could be training people in other organizations around the world with a similar enough message. Some of the more advanced modern tactics that are playing out in Ukraine. And finally, they say the Russian imperial movement has established links with other extremist groups to push out its message and enable a broader wave of radicalization in the West. This could allow it to radicalize Russians in places such as Germany, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. So you've got kind of the two threats. You've got the one where they're tying in with, nationals from other countries that generally at some degree align with their views, be it not necessarily inside of Russia, but inside of their home country. And then the other risk is that they appeal to a Russian population, be it in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, wherever it might be. And that population is not just hearing kind of the ideology of what they want to do, but also being given the means and the training and the expertise to carry out attacks to that end. So anyways, I thought it was an interesting article. It's a group that doesn't get a lot of attention, but all things considered, they're relatively influential. I'm fascinated with some of these smaller, lesser-known groups fighting in some of these conflicts, be it Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now obviously Russia and Ukraine. But again, if interested, the link to the full article is in the description below, as well as Militant Wire, who's 100% worth checking out on all their platforms if this kind of stuff is of any interest to you. And then I'll put the Twitter handles of Lucas Weber and Alec Bertina, the authors of the article. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.